Bodhidharma was an Indian monk who is credited with transmitting Zen Buddhism to China in the 5th or 6th century. Traditionally, he's depicted as a wild character. Paintings and images of him accent his bulging eyeballs, suggesting a deep intent to see through to the core of reality. The stories about him indicate that he had only that single purpose in mind. Everything else was inconsequential. According to one legend, he was so committed to gaining enlightenment that he gazed at a wall for 9 years in quest of awakening. When I came across a delicate ceramic statue of Bodhidharma in a small shop in Hong Kong, I knew I had to have it for my collection. The wild-eyed Bodhidharma was one of my heroes. I carefully packed the image for my return trip and was delighted that he made the journey across the Pacific intact. I immediately put the statue on display. And there he stood for years, looking out over my office with those serene but bulging eyes. Until the day my daughter asked if she could hold my precious ceramic image. She was 4 years old at the time, and to say I was apprehensive about giving her the image would be an understatement. But she cried, and she begged, and she cried some more. And I finally relented, but not until I had thoroughly explained to her the deep affection I had for the statue and pleaded with her to be exceedingly careful with it. She promised she would. I gingerly handed him over to her, and she mindfully took him from me. She was absolutely delighted with the strange-looking character in her hands. Then she dropped him. Yes, she did. She dropped my beloved Bodhidharma, and he was gone. I was angry. I was crushed. The centerpiece of my collection of Buddhist images was now a pile of glazed rubble. I couldn't believe it. Fortunately, I had the presence of mind not to take my anger out on her, but I was angry, and I felt the loss. It took a bit of time for me to recover my equanimity, but of course, I did. Once again, I recognized the irony of my attachment to an image of a person who embodied radical non-attachment. I reminded myself of the words of the Buddha shortly before his death. All compounded things, he said, are impermanent. This statue of Bodhidharma was certainly a compounded thing, as was now clear by the mound of ceramic fragments. I mentioned in an earlier lecture about my attachment to another statue and about how I decided to give the image away to a friend who admired it. But that was different. Earlier, I had given away the statue voluntarily. This time, the loss came against my will. Previously, I had been able to relinquish my attachment before letting the statue go. The Bodhidharma image was gone before I was prepared, and it hurt. Now I had to relinquish my attachment after the fact. In other words, I had to grieve. Grieving is the process of coming to terms with loss in our lives. Almost from the very moment we're born, we're having to deal with loss. Newborns come into the world having lost the warmth and comfort of their mother's womb. And from that instant onward, life can seem like a string of losses. Some losses, of course, are greater than others. Losing a loved one to death is more significant and more distressing for most people than losing a mere material object like a ceramic statue. But the loss of anything can cause suffering and can require the process of grieving to help us adjust. Take a moment to reflect on the losses in your own life. Almost certainly, you've lost someone close to you to death. A parent, a grandparent, a spouse, a friend, a relative. My own maternal grandmother died recently, just a few months shy of her 100th birthday. I thought about how many friends and relatives she had watched come and go during that century. Certainly one of the difficult aspects of a long life would have to be witnessing and coping with the loss of so many loved ones. We endure loss through means other than death, of course. We can lose our jobs, our life savings. We can see our cherished possessions stolen or accidentally broken. Our friends may leave because of a quarrel, or we may leave them when we move away to embark on a new career. In the American courtship system, one can undergo a series of romantic breakups before finding a spouse. And even after marriage, one faces a 50% chance of divorce. As we age, we may begin to recognize that the youthful dreams we had had for so long are unlikely to materialize. These losses can cause us to suffer greatly. For the significant losses in our lives, we need to grieve. And mindfulness practice can help facilitate our grief skillfully. Grief is a natural healing process that has several identifiable dimensions. Often these aspects of the process are referred to as stages, a notion that suggests that grief follows a predictable linear course as we come to terms with our loss. The typology of grief proposed by Elisabeth Kubler-Ross is perhaps the most widely known of these schemes. Kubler-Ross argued that grief is characterized first by denial, then anger, followed by bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. While grief certainly can include these phases and experiences, it may be misleading and potentially harmful to suggest that grief is predictable or follows a specific timetable. Each person grieves in different ways. There may be times when grief includes anger and sadness and other experiences. But the experiences may not come in a predictable sequence, and there may be no sharp divisions between these stages. The mindfulness approach to grief is not to usher us through various stages so that we might hasten onward to the final goal of acceptance. Rather, mindfulness practice can be used to ensure that we accept and fully experience whatever the process of grief brings us. Mindfully working with grief essentially means removing any obstacles that might impede the natural course of grieving. Mindfulness assists the grieving process by helping us acknowledge and accept the universality and inevitability of loss. Having to give up what we have is unavoidable. Throughout our lives, things are taken away from us, sometimes with our consent, sometimes without. Resisting necessary losses, of course, can cause us to suffer. The mindfulness insight into the impermanence of all reality helps ease our resistance to living in a world where ultimately everything that we hold dear will have to be relinquished. Kisagotami was a young woman of wealth and high status who lived during the time of the Buddha. She was married and gave birth to a son who died as a toddler. She was devastated. In her grief, she carried the lifeless body of her son from house to house and village to village, begging for medicine to bring the boy back to life. One wise man advised her to see the Buddha, who, he said, had the medicine that she needed. Pressing the lifeless boy against her heart, she began the journey. The Buddha told her to find a mustard seed from a household that had not been touched by death. Thinking the seed would be used to make the medicine she wanted, Kisagotami carried her dead child from house to house, making her request. Everyone was willing to help, but she couldn't find a single family untouched by death. Soon she realized that hers was not the only family that had faced death. At last, she brought the corpse to the forest and made a bed of leaves. Just as she placed his remains upon it, she realized the dead body was no longer her son, and her attitude towards his death immediately changed. She was then able to begin to make peace with his passing, and she returned to the Buddha to share her experience. And the Buddha said, Kisagotami, you thought that you were the only one who had lost a son. As you now realize, death comes to all beings before their desires are satisfied. On hearing this, Kisagotami fully realized the impermanence of life and understood how her refusal to accept the death of her son kept her in a state of suffering. The story of Kisagotami reminds us that loss and grieving are universal experiences. No one is exempt. The Buddha's object lesson allowed Kisagotami to discover how her refusal to acknowledge the inevitability of loss compounded her pain. She realized this truth and was then able to let her son go. I have a deep empathy with the plight of Kisagotami. She not only had to cope with the loss of her son, which was painful enough, but she had to face the shock that this event was happening to her. In my early 30s, I too had to face a similar shock. It's a shock that all of us past a certain age probably experience. It's the awareness that we are aging. For the first 2 decades of your life, you're usually looking forward to getting older and the new privileges and freedom that brings. Getting to drive a car, staying out later with friends, dating, going to college, getting married and having children. During these decades, you actually look forward to getting older, but you don't give a single thought to aging. Then one day, you look in the mirror and you see evidence that not only have you gotten older, you've actually begun to age. You can see it on your face. And when you do, it can be quite a shock. I clearly remember it happening to me. I also remember experiencing the dimension of grief known as denial. Wait a minute! This isn't supposed to be happening to me. Aging is what happens to other people. It took me quite a while to accept the fact that I was getting older and that my body and appearance were reflecting that process. I recalled the many fears I had, particularly the strange fear that if I appeared older, somehow people would no longer like me. Realizing my solidarity with everyone else, that is, recognizing that we are all getting older, helped immensely to ease that fear. We don't often recognize it, but grieving our lost youth is an experience that many of us will have to face. Being aware of the universality and inevitability of loss implies that we are well advised to begin to prepare for it now. Why wait? All throughout our lives, almost on a daily basis, we are given ample opportunities to practice mindfully coping with loss. These occasions are chances to remind ourselves of the impermanent nature of reality and of the potential hazards of becoming attached to transient things. I was able to come to terms with my shattered bodhidharma by turning my material loss into a spiritual gain. I recognized just how foolish I had been to become so attached to a mere object, a thing that I knew could not last. That's a lesson we have to relearn again and again. Even Zen masters have to be reminded of it. In a Zen monastery several centuries ago, a monk, no more than 10, accidentally broke his master's favorite antique teacup while he was cleaning. When he heard his master approach, he quickly gathered the pieces and put them behind his back. Then he cleverly asked the master, "Sir, why must people die?" The master answered, "It's natural. Everything has a finite lifespan, and everything must die." Then the novice produced the broken teacup and told his master, "It was time for your cup to die." Remembering the transience of all life helps us to avoid developing unhealthy attachments that can cause us to suffer. But how does mindfulness help us cope with the loss of those things to which we have already become attached? It's fine and good to say, avoid attachments, but on this side of enlightenment, we still get attached, and the suffering it causes is very real. What is the mindfulness approach to grieving these losses? Quite simply, it's no different from the way we handle any other unwanted experience we might have, including anger and pain. It involves acknowledging, accepting, and letting go. In other words, grief is an invitation to welcome our experience with equanimity, without fear or aversion. It is to be open to whatever grief brings us and to allow ourselves to experience that fully. As we noted, grief is not always predictable and doesn't always follow a set timetable. It has to be allowed to happen on its own, taking its own good time. I recall going through a grief experience many years ago and being advised by a wise friend who had been through the same experience to take every opportunity I could to cry. He wasn't suggesting that I force my tears, just to let them come whenever I felt the need. As a man who had always thought that holding back the expressions of sadness was courageous and manly, I greeted his advice with skepticism. But I also trusted him a great deal and decided to try what he said. I found it easiest to let the tears flow when I was alone, in part because my solitude prompted them, and in part because the lack of an audience meant that I didn't have to pretend to be courageous and manly. Over a period of several months, I cried a river of tears. Then one day, I simply observed that I had stopped crying. I hadn't shed a tear for a long time. It was then that I realized that my grief was essentially over. I still felt twinges of sadness on occasion, but the intensity of the experience had dissolved. Mindfulness is of greatest benefit in the grieving process in keeping us focused in the present moment, the place we can fully feel the pain of loss. Upon losing something or someone, our minds can race ahead and begin to worry about the future. The loss of a spouse might bring fears of loneliness and anxieties about how to cope with day-to-day affairs of living. Divorce might arouse concerns about our worthiness as a person and fears about ever finding meaningful love. Loss of something important in our lives almost inevitably provokes us to worry about how to fill that void and to face the future. These are absolutely legitimate concerns, and they must be faced. But inordinate attention to apprehensions about the future can also hinder the process of grieving, which requires momentarily setting aside these anxieties and being completely aware of our experience in the present. During the period of grief, I can think of no better practice than mindfulness meditation, which provides us a deliberate opportunity for attending to the present. As we discovered in our conversations about anger and pain, fully experiencing what we find in each moment is the precondition for thinking and acting wisely. Practicing deliberate acts of self-compassion is also essential to grieving. I can think of no time when we might need compassion more. Being self-compassionate during these periods not only means relaxing our usual tendencies towards self-judgment and criticism, it means being open to the expressions of compassion from others. During the same period of grief that I mentioned earlier, I finally permitted myself to let others reach out and befriend me, something that I always had difficulty doing. Letting others show me kindness was surprisingly comforting for a young man who had always thought of himself as self-sufficient. When I allowed others to befriend me, it suddenly seemed as if the whole world had gone through the same experience that I had. Like Kisagotami, knowing that I was not alone in my grief was immeasurably consoling. Bearing in mind one's solidarity with others in grief is one way to ease our suffering. Another is to bear in mind the serendipitous nature of life. Serendipity is the word for the phenomenon of discovering pleasant things not sought for. Part of the surprising and unpredictable quality of existence is the way that sometimes things can turn out better than we imagined or hoped. An old tale claimed by many traditions, including the Taoists and the Sufis, helps to make this point. The tale concerns an old farmer in China who tilled his land with his son. One day their horse ran away, and all their neighbors exclaimed about their bad luck. The farmer was philosophical. "Maybe it's bad luck," he said. "Maybe not." The next day the horse came back with 6 wild horses, and the neighbors changed their tune, now congratulating the farmer for his good luck. "Maybe," he said again. A few days later, when the son was riding one of the wild horses, he fell and broke his leg. Now that seemed inarguably like bad luck. But the day after that, the king's agents came to recruit able-bodied young men to go off to war. Because of his broken leg, the farmer's son was left behind. All the other young men were killed in battle, but the farmer's son eventually healed and went back to tilling the fields with his horse. The point of the story is clear. Because our foresight is so greatly limited, we're well advised not to rush to judgments about the events that happen to us. One of my friends and colleagues was denied tenure about 20 years ago. It was an unfair decision, and he was crushed. But somehow he picked up the pieces, found another job in another country, and began to flourish. He poured his grief and anger into his writing, and he became prolific and greatly respected. He retired recently, highly honored by his university. I sometimes tell Philip that not getting tenure was the best thing that ever happened to him. Remembering that we really do not know what the future holds for us except the certainty of death can often ease the anxieties we have about the future. We fear the worst, but often what turns out is for the best. But what do we do with losses that seem staggering, altogether outside the realm of normal human experience, even more unexpected than the loss of a child? There are times when people lose almost everything. One only has to think of the earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, genocides, and terrorist events of recent years. Disasters whose horrors are difficult to comprehend and to integrate into our ordinary experience of life. Perhaps you may be able to understand these events by appealing to the providence of God or the belief in rebirth or reincarnation, in which cases such massive suffering can somehow be redeemed or ameliorated. I confess that my hesitancy to make such metaphysical claims makes it difficult for me to put such losses in a comprehensive framework. I don't know if there is a heaven or an afterlife where the victims of such suffering will find paradise or perhaps another chance at life. I don't know if God is waiting on the other side of death to welcome us with open arms. Sometimes it seems that the only thing these disasters are good for is giving the survivors some perspective, which of course is no consolation to the victims. And perhaps they may provide us with some motivation to be more compassionate. These are times when ritual may come to our aid. Whatever our faith or culture, joining with others to share our grief, moving through the familiar elements of a ceremony, and sharing words that have been spoken by others in our situation for generation after generation, can help us keep in mind that this is part of our human lot and always has been. And here's where your own suffering can be of use to you. Many people find that it's not until they've had to cope with setbacks of their own that they're able to truly be compassionate for others. For as long as we meet with nothing but success, warm friendships, loving family, a rewarding job, we're likely to think that all good things have come to us because we deserve them. Only when we experience some losses ourselves do we realize we had less control over events than we had believed. It's humbling and disillusioning in the best sense of the word. It helps us rid ourselves of whatever illusions of permanence and control we may have been holding. Many mindfulness practitioners eventually come to see such losses as supports for meditation. It may be going too far to say these problems are actually welcomed, but once you have begun to use the tools of mindfulness in your daily life, it's almost certainly true that you will at least see your problems as opportunities for gaining a more intimate knowledge of the way your mind works. If you practice developing skillful means with life's everyday challenges, you'll be able to react more skillfully when the greater losses come to you, as they inevitably will. You'll understand that you're not being singled out for suffering. You're just having a life. In the next lecture, we'll look more closely at one more thing that comes to us all: having a death.